Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todayswillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Wills and Probate podcast. Today we are talking about Remember a Charity, and very specifically Remember a Charity Week, 8th to the 14th of September later on this year. And we have on the podcast with us Lucinda Frostick, Director of Remember a Charity, and delighted to welcome Meg Edwards, a solicitor in the Trusts and Estates Disputes team at Shakespeare Martineau. And opportunity today to bring to life what Remember a Charity is all about. There's a recent report that was published kind of outlining some of the challenges around charity legacies and very specifically the difference between the intent to leave legacies and the actual number of legacies that are left as well. So lots of really interesting topics to cover today. In the first instance, though, I wonder if Lucinda and Meg, you might do a short introduction to yourselves, please. Lucinda, in the first instance.
Of course. Firstly, thanks so much for welcoming us today. I'm Lucinda, Director of Remember a Charity. For those of you that aren't necessarily familiar with Remember a Charity already, we're a consortium of around 200 charities. We work with professional advisors, partners, government and many others to grow legacy giving across the UK.
Thank you. And Meg, please.
Yeah, thank you, David. So I'm Meg Edwards. I'm a solicitor in the Trusts and Estates Disputes team at Shakespeare Martineau. So my work is quite wide-ranging. So anything from sort of will disputes, inheritance act claims, removal of executor or trustee claims to court protection.
Fab. Let's start out with some of the statistics that came out of the report, in which there's a notable uptick in the number of practitioners that are proactively making clients aware of charity and charitable bequests. And that's a trend that's kind of been moving in the right direction as far as you're concerned, Lucinda, for the past couple of years, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. It's something we've tracked over many years now by talking to solicitors, will writers, and more recently financial advisors around their approach to legacy giving and the sort of conversations that they're having with clients. And we do this through a kind of tracking research project that's carried out by Savanta. And what's really interesting is to see, I think the most recent data shows us that the proportion of solicitors and will writers always or sometimes raising the topic of charitable giving, and that's in the form of giving through a will, has risen from around 72% in 2023 to 2024 to 77% 2024 to 2025. But more longer term, we're just seeing that slow, steady increase. And I think that's reflective of a couple of things, really. Partly, there's greater confidence and knowledge amongst advisors. That's certainly part of it. But also, I think there's a real recognition that this is something the public want to do. There's desire amongst the client base to do social good, to achieve something really meaningful and wonderful in supporting good causes from their estate. This is an opportunity for people to give back to charities that they've supported in their lifetime. And we all know, I think, and are connected to very different types of charities depending on a very unique journey that our lives take. And I think that sort of knowledge that they can do this while also supporting their loved ones can be really powerful. And what we're hearing from advisors is it's not only that they themselves are raising the topic with clients, but clients are often raising the topic with them as well. So it's great to see that conversation going both ways.
It's interesting to hear that you say people are coming to you and raising that topic, because the research again seems to indicate that people are better informed, or should I say more informed about what's happening in their world, tax changes, pension changes. You'd have to be living under a rock not to know about IHT changes currently. But are they better informed, Meg? Do they understand them? Or is it the case that they just kind of come along and they say, well, look, I kind of know I need to be doing something about this, but I'm not really sure what?
I think it's a bit of both, to be honest. Like you said, it is hard to ignore all the sort of media around these tax changes and pension fund changes, but they are definitely a contributing factor to, more people making these charitable bequests. And it is more important than ever before that we discuss these changes and charitable giving with clients. So if anybody's not aware of the changes, so essentially the government has confirmed that inheritance tax thresholds, so meaning the nil rate band, which is currently set at £325,000, and the residential nil rate band, which is currently set at £175,000, they're being frozen until 2030. And they've also confirmed that generally pension funds will form part of a person's estate for inheritance tax purposes. And I think where clients' concerns come in is that when we think of that in the context of, inflation, rising property values, etc., the freezes and the treatment of pension funds is essentially going to mean that more estates are subject to inheritance tax. And that's particularly so in the case of individuals who perhaps don't have the benefit of transferable nil rate bands or aren't able to leave their properties to direct descendants, so won't have the benefit of the residential nil rate band. I actually looked at some figures which suggested that, I think it was March of this year, the average house price in the UK was £271,000. So, you've only got to add, a reasonably sized pension pot to that, some cash in the bank, and it's really not going to take much for an estate to possibly fall into the realms of being taxable, particularly if there aren't any other reliefs available. And I actually saw a report the other day that said that the proportion of estates which will qualify for inheritance tax will almost have doubled between now and 2030, which is, quite a significant figure. I think it was something like 5.2% to 9.6% or something like that. So we are going to see a significant increase in taxable estates. So I think, the tax considerations are definitely important, but I think we also can't ignore that practitioners are probably raising the possibility of giving to charities in the context of sort of more modern or difficult family dynamics these days. So in the context of backstop beneficiary, so if you've got a client who perhaps wants to leave their estate to their only child, who's an adult, and failing them to that child's children, so your client's grandchildren, that's fine. But what if the child and the grandchildren were to predecease your client? The estate would fall on an intestacy, and it might be the case that the sole beneficiary would be your client's brother, who she maybe hasn't spoken to in 30 years, for example. So that wouldn't be an ideal situation, and it's not something that your client would want. So in that context, naming a charity as a sort of, backstop beneficiary is an effective way of trying to prevent those sorts of unforeseen circumstances, essentially.
I mean, as a contentious practitioner, you will attest to the rise, I suppose, in the number of contested probate cases there are.
Yeah.
Are you starting to see legacies and charitable giving being used as a tool in that context then, Meg?
That's a bit of a difficult question to answer. I mean, I haven't really seen anything like that yet, just because I think we're not at the stage where the repercussions of the increase in contentious probate cases are sort of coming to light. But I imagine, the research showed that practitioners are particularly concerned about estate disputes arising further down the line. So I think if they can advise their clients of different ways to try and mitigate that, obviously, you can't guarantee to your client that a dispute won't arise. It's not possible. But to try and mitigate disputes arising, to try and suggest, these backstop beneficiaries, I think we are just trying to manage what we can while we can, essentially.
And there are benefits, Lucinda, aren't there, to leaving money to charity, because there's a knock-on impact on your tax again, isn't there, in terms of your estate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's obviously numerous philanthropic benefits, and to the multitude of causes and beneficiaries that are so fortunate to be able to benefit from the generosity of people who choose to leave gifts in their wills. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the tax regime here in the UK is probably as advantageous as you could imagine, in the sense that all gifts to charity are tax-free, and that for those people who choose to give a gift that equates to 10% more of the net value of the estate. The estate will benefit from a reduced rate of inheritance tax. I know Meg will probably be able to speak about that in a much more informed way than I can. But I think what's really interesting is, I'd be the first to advocate for the wonderful advantages of these tax incentives. But I think it's relatively rare, actually, that those tax incentives are the key driver. They're so rarely the thing that drives people to give. Usually when somebody gives, it's because that's what they want to do. They're inspired to give. They've got a charity they feel particularly passionate about. They want to do something meaningful at the end of their lives. And that's what we're here to try and encourage people and help them be able to do. But I think where tax incentives are really, really powerful is sort of tying back to some of the conversation that we had about that Meg raised at the beginning, is it's the main reason certainly that advisors tell us that they bring up the topic with their clients, because it's an attractive offering. It's a positive way to frame the option of legacy giving, whether or not they know if that person does have sort of charitable intentions or charitable connections. Tax incentives are just a very natural and comfortable way for advisors to approach it. So from that perspective, it's really powerful because it helps to create an environment where legacy giving really can become a social norm.
And just to put into context, the value, I suppose, of legacies to charities, they make up somewhere between 30 and 50% of their overall income generally, and in some cases even more, don't they, Lucinda?
So that's such a good question, because actually I think it really, really depends from charity to charity. So there are an increasing number of charities that are named in wills each year, but it's not yet every charity across the board. For those that have established legacy income pipelines, yes, absolutely, it can be a really significant amount. For the top sort of 1,000 charities that are named in wills each year, it tends to be around £3 in every £10 of their entire voluntary income, so 30% of their voluntary income that comes through gifts and wills. For other charities, it can be significantly more. In fact, I spoke to a smaller charity which does an amazing service in supporting people living alone in the community and those living with dementia, and putting them into contact with sort of local animals to not only help the animals, and these are animals that have been rescued, but also to give so many sort of mental health benefits and to treat sort of loneliness within those communities. And that particular charity, which is fairly new to legacies, but it now benefits from, I think, about 80% of their voluntary income is raised through gifts and wills. So they're becoming increasingly important, I think, at a community level, which is wonderful, because while remember charity, we certainly represent very large charities as well, through to very small. I think in our early days, we're now 25 years old, and when we started, we were very much a kind of a collective group of very large organisations who started to see something wonderful and wanted to help create that social norm where every charity could benefit and where everyone knew they could leave money to charity in their will. We're now in a very different place, which is extremely exciting, because I think we're seeing, amongst charity supporters anyway, we're seeing 21% of charity supporters age 40 plus now choosing to leave a gift in their will. We're getting closer and closer to that becoming a social norm. And when you consider what that might mean in terms of income for future services and the way that we can all impact the world we leave behind, it's a really exciting and really substantial development.
Yeah, so just to follow on from what Lucinda was saying, so yes, any gifts that are made to charity from an estate are entirely exempt from inheritance tax. So the value of the gift is deducted from the value of the chargeable estate. And if you've got a client who leaves 10% or more of the value of their chargeable estate to charity, as Lucinda said, the benefits are even greater, because not only is the value of the gift deducted from the value of the chargeable estate, but generally inheritance tax will be payable at a reduced rate of 36%. Now, I know clients can have queries about the tax advantages and how they can ensure that that figure of 10% is met when it comes to preparing their will, because it is very likely that the value of their estate will have changed between the date on which the will is drafted and the date they pass away. So there are a couple of things that practitioners can just be aware of when it comes to that. So firstly, it might be worth considering with the client whether it's worth putting in the will some sort of clause which defines the charitable gift within the will as a sum equal to or perhaps more than 10% of the chargeable value of the estate. Some other concerns clients can have if they are choosing to leave a proportion of their estate, they might have some concerns that the gift leaves too much to charity or it leaves too little to charity. So in that case, you can discuss whether your client wants to set a minimum value for a gift or a maximum value. It might also be that the client wants certain legacies within their will to take priority over others. So again, just make sure that that's clear within the terms of the will. And I have just touched on this, but I think it's also worth mentioning that gifts to charity don't have to be a set lump sum. So you can leave a proportion of your residuary estate to charity, or you could it doesn't even have to be cash. It can be items that you own, it can be physical property, artwork, but it could even be, cryptocurrency, intellectual property, intangible things as well. So just things to be aware of.
It's interesting, Lucinda, you talk about the fact that the tax implications isn't actually always the kind of key driver behind this, that there is a big charitable element. However, there is still a sizable gap between the intention to give, and by all accounts your research indicates that about 2 in 5 would intend to leave a gift, and action, which is closer to 1 in 5. Have we any sort of understanding as to why that is?
I think that's a really interesting question. Perhaps there's always going to be a little bit of a gap between intention and action in terms of the things we all intend to do and what we actually get around to doing, let alone when it comes to writing a will. I know I certainly didn't write my will right at the outside of when I should, but I'm sort of conscious that thinking about that question in the context of your listeners and what role perhaps we can play to close that gap is probably the best way that I can come at that. Because thinking again about listeners today, so solicitors, will writers and other advisors, it's not, of course, your duty to be fundraisers or to approach this topic from a perspective of how we close that gap. It's simply a case of making sure that clients have the right information available to them so that they can understand all their options, charitable and otherwise. And we know it's quite a complex maze there when it comes to talking about wills. And obviously to support them in making the right decision for them and making the best will in the best way, and hopefully avoiding a situation where their final wishes aren't met. But the truth is that alone really can make a massive difference. There are still too many people who don't know they can leave a gift for charity alongside their loved ones in their wills. There are too many people who think you have to be rich to do it, or to think that perhaps this is something for celebrities, the high and the mighty, the royals, when in reality, actually what we're seeing is the most wonderful stories coming through of people like you and I, people who don't necessarily have huge amounts of wealth, who just want to ensure that the causes they care about in their lifetime get to live on. So actually having that kind of conversation starter is a massive key, really, for us in terms of the things that you can do to drive change, just making sure people know they've got that option. We know from previous research and behaviour insight studies that we've carried out that just by raising the topic, you double the chances that a client will go ahead and do it. So any conversation you have in that space, I think, is a really positive thing. And from our perspective at Remember a Charity, well, yes, there's certainly more that we can do. We're talking with will writing software providers about, for example, how they reference the charitable element within their software packages, ensuring that it's clearly articulated there so that more solicitors and advisors might be talking about it with their clients. We're working with government to protect and potentially even enhance the tax incentives in this space. We talked already about what key role they have to play in getting that conversation started. And of course, we continue to share inspiring stories from our members about just what a difference a legacy can make, so that we can encourage people to connect with those stories, to find this form of giving relatable, and to think about the causes that really matter to them so that they can do it too.
Yeah, and Lucinda, just to add on to that, actually, I thought it was quite interesting from the report to read that advisors think that their clients' priorities are to pass on assets to family and friends, and that they actually think that charitable gifting can, as we've mentioned, cause disputes with family or, potential beneficiaries later down the line. But on the contrary, the public identify the barriers as being, yes, they want to leave everything to their loved ones, perhaps, but also they worry that they won't have enough money in their estate to leave anything to charity. And as we mentioned, actually 24% of people actually just don't think of making a charitable gift at the time they're making the will. So just a few sort of top discussion points just from a practitioner's point of view. So if a client wants to leave a charitable gift, but they're worried about not having money to do so, then, the various drafting clauses I mentioned just now are something that can be discussed with them. And like we spoke about, it doesn't need to be a set sum of money if affordability is a particular concern. What struck me as, a trust and estates disputes lawyer is that there is still some reluctance from advisors to broach the subject of charitable gifting because they don't want to be seen to influence their clients. And then a sort of add on to that is they don't want an estate dispute to arise further down the line. And I do, completely understand that. But I think asking a client whether they're intending on making a gift to charity is a legitimate question in the context of taking will writing instructions and in the context of estate planning. So I think when it comes to the influence point, advisors just really want to make sure that the questions they're asking are open and general in nature. So while, the firm you work at might have partnered with a specific charity, which is absolutely great, it is best to avoid suggesting or encouraging gifts to specific charities or causes. And a key point, which I honestly cannot stress enough, is when you're having these conversations with clients, it's keeping detailed and clear file notes. So, things along the lines of, I asked Mr. Jones if he'd considered making a gift to charity. He told me that yes, he wanted to leave a gift of X amount to X charity as they'd supported him perhaps during a difficult time 5 years or so ago when he was unwell. So just by making a file note like that, if there is any dispute later down the line, there is clear evidence of what your client's intentions were and the reasoning behind the gift. Another thing that might be useful, and if your client's comfortable in doing so, is encouraging them to have conversations with their family and loved ones. So, are they happy to just let their spouse or their children know that, look, I have updated my will, I've made a gift of X amount to X charity because of this reason. That can be a very effective way of managing expectations. I think another concern of practitioners, which again I completely understand, is if you've got a client who does want to leave something to charity, but in doing so they're disinheriting a child or perhaps a previous beneficiary or an intestacy beneficiary. Now, if that is the case, you probably want to be suggesting that they prepare a statement of reasons, which, as the name suggests, really sets out the reasons they're choosing to benefit that charity and that particular charity over a previous beneficiary or relative. And the key in preparing that statement is to focus on why that charity in particular is being chosen. So providing some context, as I sort of mentioned earlier. Did the charity help them through a difficult time? Does the charity simply align with their values? Or, is the charity some sort of cause that they're particularly passionate about? So as much detail as you can put in those statements, the better. And the last point that I picked up on, sorry, I've gone on a bit, but it was that practitioners were concerned about their clients choosing a charity. So if your client's not sure what charity they want to support, but they do want to support some charity, practitioners were quite concerned about giving any suggestions or influencing in any way. Now, again, it is best not to suggest specific charities, but have an open conversation with your clients and talk about what causes they're passionate about or interested in, and just make sure you've got a detailed note of that conversation. And, if the circumstances allow, you might want to suggest that your client goes away to think about it, does some research of their own into what charities might be suitable, perhaps just lets you have their instructions on that a couple of days later. There's nothing wrong with doing that either, provided the circumstances allow.
Is it okay for me to just jump in on the back of that, actually? Because we did a workshop recently with wealth advisors, and so much of what you're saying is ringing true as common themes that we discussed during that session. But there was an additional point, which I don't know if that's cropped up with you, Meg, but certainly was something that seemed to have a lot of resonance with that particular group, which was that a lot of them referenced a lot of their clients' charitable trustees, and they might mention it in another context during talking about their will. And actually, that also is a really natural kind of starting point to go, okay, or at least a point to clock and to recognise, well, I know that charity or that supporting charities is important to you. You're a charitable trustee. So building on that, just wanted to highlight whether this is something that might be of interest to you as well. So I don't know if that's cropped up in your conversations, Meg, but I thought it's really interesting that seemed to be really pertinent certainly amongst kind of higher net worth clients anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's encouraging as much conversation as you can, essentially. So if you have got a client who's a charitable trustee, you know, they're probably better versed than any practitioners would be about, you know, which charities are aligned with their passions and the causes they're passionate about.
As the publisher of 3 online news publications, one catering for conveyancers, one catering for family lawyers and for wills and probate, and similar podcasts and lots of conversations in and around this space as well. What is very obvious to me is that we have to have a much more holistic view of the client, and you know, whether it's wealth management, as you've alluded to, Lucinda, whether it's private client, whether it's planning, tax planning and financial planning throughout a family matter, you know, for example, through a divorce process or something like that, which of course, you know, has an impact on your estate planning as well. There has to be a much more joined up approach to client service, I think, and I think the profession can work much better together on that. That's probably more of a point than a question. But I before we kind of move to the close of the discussion, and we're fast running out of time, I also wanted to just reiterate and pick up on what you said earlier, Lucinda, about the lawyer not being the fundraiser, because I think that's really an important point here, and to some of what you've said there, Meg, about the risks and pitfalls actually of the lawyer being too involved. Because, and I've said before, I really enjoy talking to contentious practitioners because you've seen what goes wrong, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, when you're meeting with clients, and I know I'm probably preaching to the converted, but detailed file notes are so useful if estate disputes do arise sort of further down the line, because one of the first things we'll do as contentious practitioners is we will request a copy of the will file. That includes, you know, any draft wills, notes of meetings with clients, everything that's included within the solicitor's file or the practitioner's file. And if there is a detailed file note in there which says, you know, the client wanted to leave this legacy to this charity because of X, Y, and Z, that is probably going to be quite convincing evidence, provided you know everything like capacity, knowledge and approval satisfied and there's no influence or anything like that. That is probably quite convincing evidence of the testator's instructions.
Let's move to a close. And before we finish the discussion, I just wanted to pick your brains really from again, a practical point of view for those listening on what we can draw out of your research this year, Lucinda, on how we can introduce those conversations with clients. What's the most effective way to introduce those conversations with clients, and some best practice around that?
Well, I'm going to approach that quite broadly, David, if that's okay, because I'm really conscious that Meg is the expert in the room as a practitioner in terms of how to go about having these conversations. But just to kind of to take it back to what the report shows us and the kind of key themes that emerge from that, it reinforces the fact that legacy giving is indeed growing, that professional advisors play a really crucial role in not only obviously supporting people ensure their final wishes are met and they write their will in the best way, but it can be a broad set of wishes. It can include loved ones alongside, of course, charitable gifts too, and that clients take great joy from that. But there's an opportunity for us all to be a little bit more proactive in that space. I really like what you said earlier about taking a holistic approach. I think we're on the same page with that. I think what we all want really is a world where people come and see advisors or write their will, and whatever is the best way for them, they have access to the best advice and support available to ensure that they can take care of all those things they care about in their will, and that they have a really great experience from it. So if I was to draw it down just to one tip that emerges from it before I pass over to Meg, who can give us proper insight into it all, I guess for me, it would just be about getting that conversation started. Talking about charitable giving really can be so engaging, a really positive conversation to have with clients. So sort of overcoming any misgivings you have and exploring different ways to get that conversation started and choosing the one that works most comfortably and most naturally with you, depending on your client base. I would say that's probably the key thing from my perspective. And if you don't already, Remember a Charity Week can be a great way to get involved. So do give us a Google and hopefully we can help you get those conversations started. But I'm sure Meg can kind of bounce off that and share more sort of insights when it comes to tips and best practice.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that, Lucinda. And I think taking a holistic approach is extremely important. I think it's important not to assume that your client knows exactly what they want to do with their estate, because they might not be as well informed as you think they are. And, we know not everything we read in the media is 100% accurate. So it's just important to discuss those things with them. And it might be that they do know what they want to do, and that's great. But I think asking open questions is extremely important, and letting the client do the talking, essentially, and asking if they've considered making a charitable gift, as I've mentioned, is a legitimate estate planning question. Another tip I would say is, if you are dealing with a sizable estate that's going to be hit with, a chunky inheritance tax bill, talk about the tax advantages of leaving a gift to charity and the lower rate that is payable generally if you leave 10% or more of the value of the estate to charity. Because I don't think I've come across a client to date that won't avoid tax if they can avoid paying inheritance tax. It's just something that really, I think, is relatable to clients. If you are dealing with an estate where there are difficult family dynamics, or the client's estranged from certain family members or something like that, talk about the benefits of having a backstop beneficiary. It can really help give your clients peace of mind above everybody else. If there is somebody they definitely don't want to benefit from their estate, it can really help in those situations. And I know this will probably be the fifth or sixth time that I mention this, but given the concerns that practitioners have about influence, just make sure to keep clear and detailed attendance notes. So that's, the first time that you meet your client, any phone calls that you have during the preparation of the will. If your client comes to the office to execute the will, just note who's there, what you discussed, whether they were happy with the will, whether they wanted to make any changes to the will. If they did, what those changes were, etc. Just make sure there is a note of everything, essentially.
If I had £1 for every time I've heard a contentious practitioner tell me to keep contemporaneous notes, I wouldn't be doing this podcast.
I'm sure it's very boring to hear all the time, but it's so important.
We've reached the end of the time that we have together, and I'm very grateful to you both for sharing your time and your insight, and for talking a little bit about Remember a Charity. The week is the 8th to the 14th of September. As you said, Lucinda, you can go on the website and get involved.
Absolutely, yes. So at Remember a Charity, we run a free scheme for solicitors and professional will writers, so that effectively we can equip you with a whole range of promotional assets and so on for those who want to get involved and start talking about charitable giving with their clients. Remember a Charity Week's a great opportunity to do it. We have a campaign supporter scheme and a charity champion scheme. So yeah, give us Google and hopefully we can help you find out more and take those conversations onto the next level.
Fab, thank you. Well, it's been great to have you both on the podcast. Thank you so much. The Today's Wills and Probate podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on today'swillsandprobate.co.uk. My thanks to Meg and to Lucinda. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.